Okay, so we return for another episode of Can't Make Time, apparently. And we had started on the preface last week and we were pursuing the question, how is it possible to change the world? I suggested that this question is equivocal or can have many meanings. How is it possible to change the world practically? How might we engage with our surroundings and our environment in order to make them a better place? So, how to actually physically change the world. And then theoretically, the other side of the question that I suggested was, how is it possible to change the world? Meaning, what is the world? And how can we know what it is? And when we theoretically frame our concept of world, we might be changing the world in a much more fundamental sense. We might be approaching the question from a different angle. Um, and in that respect, Kant is doing a little bit of both, I want to suggest. There's the theoretical aspect of him physically reconceiving what it means to be in the world, but there's also the practical aspect of maybe ethics that comes later. And there's a maybe if we want to keep ethics distinct from another practical aspect, we might call the question pragmatic. And the pragmatic question would be, how do we change the world? And in that context, the question would mean, how do we interact with other people, our intellectual heritage, everything that's already in the table in the world, such that we can conceive of the world differently and help others in that process as well. Uh, so last week we had gone through some of the basic moves in the preface to the A edition. We're about a page in. As you can see, we're on page 100 at the moment instead of 99. And I suggested that we begin by talking about what reason is and whether reason is divine reason or human reason, and figuring out where reason or human reason gets its problems from. Um, and not coming to decisions too quickly about Kant's languaging, because that would presuppose the very thing that he's trying to accomplish in the critique of pure reason, which is to make an intellectual shift from the previous traditions that followed him in philosophy. And after that, we went on to spell out the basic steps and intellectual positions that were already out on the table at the time that Kant was writing. So we talked about dogmatism, and that was the opening stage of metaphysics. And we characterize the dogmatics as ancient philosophers like Aristotle, who attempted to read off the character of being directly, um, who just assumed or took for granted that knowing and being could be in immediate relationship with one another. We then moved on to somebody like the skeptic, who Tom suggested, or I probed him to suggest, our prime example of was Descartes, um, who makes the inward turn, the subjective turn, and focuses on the characteristic of our knowing and our ability to have access to the external world around us through his dream argument in the Meditations. And finally, we reached the stage of indifferentism, where I became a little bit of a terror and suggested that we shouldn't care about metaphysics. Metaphysics is just rubbish, and we should just go on indifferently and just do science straight off, as if though we couldn't know anything about being. Actually, funnily enough, one of my students this week, when asked about one of the things that's unimaginable, said that being, like a pure being, is unthinkable. And I was like, wow, this is a very common position that people are coming into the world with at the moment. So it seems like there is this crisis of indifferentism that still continues in the sciences today. But after pretending to be a terror for a little while, I suggested that Kant had a sort of argument against indifferentism. And it's the preface, so the argument isn't fully fleshed out, but we have a general idea. And the argument was contained in line 100, on this line on page 100, where Kant says, for it is pointless to affect indifference with respect to such inquiries to whose object human nature cannot be indifferent. And so I suggested that the object that we were talking about was the object of metaphysics, which is being. And I suggested that when the indifferentists think anything at all, the second set of lines, um, to the extent that they think anything at all, always unavoidably fall back into metaphysical assertions. And the reason for that was insofar as they think something, the thing that they think about is itself a being, and so has some relation to being as such, or the object of metaphysics, the nature of being. We need to know what reality is to know that our thoughts refer to some kind of reality. Um, and so that was the way that I framed the argument last week. But I realized upon further reflection that this framing gave the argument a particular flavor. And I want to say that it is an epistemological slant on the argument. I focused on the skeptics or the indifferentists' thinking rather than their being. So there's multiple ways in which this sort of quick argument could be taken. It could be taken to mean that these so-called indifferentists, to the extent that they think anything at all, always fall back into metaphysical assertions. So their assertions could be metaphysical, and that's the thought aspect of this argument. The thing that they talk about is some kind of being. The assertion itself could be a metaphysical object, since an assertion is made with words, and words involve language. And insofar as the assertion exists, it also has a kind of being. It is a reality insofar as it's asserted. The other one was that their own actual physical embodiment or their being is another instance of being. So there's these many ways in which being enters into the indifferentist picture. And just by acting in certain ways, by thinking about something, by using words, by basically being any kind of reality or exemplifying any kind of reality, the indifferentists are already caught up in some kind of metaphysical uh, engagement. But that not only does that help us overcome indifferentists, it raises a secondary problem that's really interesting and that Tom pointed us towards, and that I think is important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the series, which is if metaphysics is the study of being and being applies to everything, isn't everything metaphysics? So by saying that metaphysics applies to everything, we've now, it appears to have diminished the scope of metaphysics by making it apply to every single thing. And so now metaphysics is not a single science, but could be many sciences or could be many things. And if it's many things, then it's not one. And so it turns out not to be metaphysics. So what I want to suggest is, although this argument helps us on the one hand by showing that we are always doing metaphysics, it also poses a serious problem that we as metaphysicians have to address, which is what the particular scope of metaphysics is, such that we do not sort of infect other sciences or we do not overstep our own domain. So that's just something that I wanted to point to. And the main reason that I wanted to point it out is because one of the many ways that Kant is read is as an epistemologist, is as someone who's only thinking about the nature of thinking and who radically leaves behind the nature of reality. But I'm not sure that's quite right. And I think that the ambiguities in this text lend to different ways of emphasizing him. One can either think of him as an epistemologist or as a metaphysician or as an ontologist, depending on how we read the text. And I think a good reading would probably do justice to all those aspects in the correct way rather than overemphasizing one over the other. So what I want to put out on the table is how are we to think about being or reality? That's what I want to be. Um,
Am I coming through to you? Your connection is a bit jumpy on my side. Uh,
I can hear you, but you
okay.
are a bit like crackly.
Um, I can hear you now. It seems to be back. Yeah. We are both of our sides having some connectivity issues. Um, what we with when you broke off, I think you were concluding the indifferentist, or where you're framing how we might think about Kant's project in terms of the scope of metaphysics, and um, you were there from the looking at the indifferentist.
Yeah, so I sort of was trying to show that the scope of metaphysics might be too wide if we conceive it to apply to everything,
Yeah,
and that is itself a problem. So now that we're at the stage of indifferentism, indifferentism is a problematic stage in the history of the self-development of philosophy. And so we are faced with problem upon problem, and we want to hold these problems in our mind to see whether Kant is going to provide a solution to them and how we can reframe the scope of reality and the scope of philosophy in order to overcome indifferentism. Because one of the reasons one might think that indifferentism comes on the scene is just precisely because of the lack of boundaries in science, right? We
yes,
say that metaphysics applies to everything. We just say, yeah, man, metaphysics is everywhere. And then people are like, well, there's other things. There's natural science and there's psychology and all of these things. And
yeah,
I want to say, well, that's all metaphysics. But that doesn't sound quite right because then metaphysics doesn't have its own particular subject matter. And so, even though there may be an element of metaphysics contained in everything, we want to figure out what metaphysics is so we don't say that metaphysics is everything.
yes. The the phrasing that I came to this morning, that that's influenced by engaging with people who are influenced by psychoanalysis. It's Kant is something like the castration of metaphysics, or Kant castrates metaphysics prior to him. And I think another word that might be there is like an impotence. So the way that I track that is we have we have reason,
Mm-hmm.
and then pure reason, or reason. This was striking me this week, is that reason has this nature of transcending itself. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of gives itself its own problems according to its own nature, and those problems aren't solvable on the terms by which it gave itself its own problems. And
Yeah.
so it has this self-transcending propensity in it. And then it
Mm-hmm.
can almost um, become sequestered, or I don't know if that's the correct word, but it starts it starts determining itself in a special domain that we might have called metaphysics prior.
Mm-hmm.
And there seem to be two consequences of, or two possibilities of, pure reason in the dogmatist and the skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's dogmatically holding to an idea, um, being is, or I know being, and then the skeptic knowledge of things is not possible. But so then the scope or the place in the project, it's seeming to me, and the phrasing, I guess, is as this some kind of castration, which is like limiting or giving metaphysics its proper bounds. And then I think that was or its place, the place where it's doing its work. And this is something to do with reason, or what reason can apply to appropriately. And then we have that idea of something fundamental turning, as in terms of like what knowledge is it of objects, or but just to nip that in a bud, to like just it will be an ongoing question: what is metaphysics of, or what is its scope? The To get in with the speaking of the indifferentist, I'll try and draw like a because as much as this is an important historical philosophical event to process, I mean, just this week I was like confronted by a friend saying like, why are you spending your time reading Kant? Exactly. Like, why are you talking about this? Why are you thinking about it? Isn't there something better you should be spend, like more useful, that you should be doing? So there's a quality of indifference and contradiction in that instance. It would be to be like, okay, what are we doing when we are determining usefulness, or what's the idea of usefulness that is operative on your side, and then that becomes its own conversation. I don't know if that, I guess I'm just trying to I'm linking my own experience in with it, of encountering like what does one say to one that comes with with like an indifferent attitude. The idea was that, or I mean, the two ways that I captured, I think you said more than two, but it's you were talking about maybe the metaphysical status of a simple assertion, of simply asserting something, and then you're also gesturing towards the being of the one who makes the assertion, like being can't be known, or metaphysics is not a worthwhile pursuit, or like, why are you spending time thinking about thinking, or thinking about being, or what we can know, or what we can know with reason, or what the function of reason, or what the nature of reason is. Like, why are you doing that? You should be doing so I have it then appears like a strange to say indifferent, because it's a on closer investigation, it's not indifferent. And I think here's where the potency of the word like castration and impotence comes in, because that indifference with the little scratching, it turns out to have a charge, in that there's an offense in you attending to this, in the metaphysical idea. So then it becomes, this is the thread of the postulating might be the word, or speculating. It might be something like such a project of coming to think the limits of reason, the limits of one's reason, so the scope of metaphysics and what one can do in it, is going to be a limitation of something that one might be enjoying, one's implicit metaphysics. So if you undertake the critique, you might be undertaking a kind of castration, a coming to terms with the impotence of your reason, if uncritiqued, is taken to be able to postulate about being in simple terms and possess knowledge of being. So then Kant is like this figure in a philosophical historical sense that is an event that castrates the metaphysics that was practiced prior, and thinking post Kant requires really metabolizing what he was saying or doing. But I'm glad that that came in a circle back to the castration. So yeah, I think we have quite a terrain here. Where would you feel to go?
I want to say a bit more about, I want to dig into this and maybe intensify a little bit. And I also maybe want to change your wording slightly. Because castration sounds like violent. It sounds like there's something like negative about it. And I think that that's fine. I think we can keep both
Yes.
in mind. But the way Kant will describe his project towards the end of the critique, and we're anticipating too much, is as a self-discipline. Uh, and we'll see that sort of self-disciplined character coming out in a second when we read a bit further. But that just gives it a maybe different flavor to castration. Like castration sounds like something that you implement on something else, right? Like you need to castrate your dog or something so it doesn't have babies like out of nowhere or something. But self-discipline might be some sort of like self-imposed limitation. So it's the different kinds of
Ah,
ways. Like, are the boundaries given from outside of us, from
yeah,
being in the nature of reality, or do we self-determine the boundaries and give ourselves this uh, restriction? Like, where does
that's
the
wonderful.
restriction come from? Is an important question to think about, and whether it should come from being or whether it should come from us, whether the restriction is external or internal is very important. And then you brought up this thing about your friend who was questioning you about why you're reading Kant. Presumably, you should be doing something else, working, getting a job, doing all these like pragmatic, useful things, allegedly. Uh, and I think this is really one of the other issues that Kant might be dealing with is how to argue against someone that you can't argue against, right? Like how to have a philosophical discussion with somebody that won't listen to reason, right? Whatever reason turns out to mean or be. It seems like Kant is faced with this at all angles of the historical time because the dogmatists have this sort of like overexcited reason. And so their rationality won't listen to any sort of reason that goes against it, right? They won't listen to the skeptics, which is why they keep building these towers, is how he puts it. And the skeptics are not listening to the sort of dogmatic reason and anything that it might contribute to philosophical knowledge. They too are being sort of like rationally irrational. They have this weird, like, they reason themselves into a corner and they can't get themselves out of this, like, inability to know being after thinking about knowing. And the indifferentists are even worse because not only have they seceded that everything that has happened in the history of philosophy has come to naught, right? Has had no result. They think that we can't determine the nature of being or the nature of reason. And this is so prevalent in contemporary like thought that like, we can't know being, we can't know reason, we can't even like the question isn't even allowed to leave our lips anymore. Like you can't even get the words out your mouth. Like, have you heard about like the critique of pure reason? Do you know about this account of being or whatever? And so that is difficult. How do you show someone the value of an endeavor like the critique, and what sort of a move can you make? There might be something about the performativity of the argumentation, right? That the indifferentists come to realize their own self-contradiction through engaging in an act that undermines itself, the act of asserting, the act of being, the act of thinking, right? All of these actions have this self reflexivity in which insofar as they think something, the very act of thinking points to a being beyond it, or insofar as they are something, they themselves have a being and are beings, and so have this relationship to being that they're already in, and can only deny if they are, right? They couldn't
Yeah.
deny it if they weren't. It seems inescapable. And so the problem is for Kant to determine these boundaries, to show the history of philosophy what, you know, its proper domain or scope should be, in a way that almost they have to see for themselves. They have to watch it blossom for themselves. And so one of the things that we should be keeping in mind is how to how to reason against reason, or something like how to argue rationally against irrational positions or rational positions, because argumentation always takes place in some sort of a context, and having that in mind helps us to figure out how we should approach the subject matter. I also just want to say quickly that like this the weird thing about Kant is like this history seems, depending on how you understand history, history seems like an empirical thing, right? It seems like precisely the type of thing that we shouldn't be beginning metaphysics from, right? Because it's some sort of background information. It seems like we're taking a lot for granted when we say, this is what philosophy has done, this is the subject matter, and this is how we're going to go about it. It seems like we just observed the past and it could have been completely different than how it is. But we might want to keep in mind what sort of a history is at issue here. If it's really something um, empirical in that way, like is intellectual heritage something that comes to be contingently in the world through a series of happenstance, or is there a deeper significance where it is part of the very nature of what being is? Um, yeah, so I think we should maybe read on a little bit and start off from the line
Would,
after the differentist argument.
would you zoom in just a bit, for my sake, and then also if somebody watches on a phone and they want to read along
Sure.
on a smaller screen?
Okay. Do you want to read? It's from Nevertheless.
Sweet. So you'll have to scroll for me. Huh? Nevertheless, this indifference, occurring amid the flourishing of all sciences and directed precisely at those sciences whose results, if such are to be had at all, we could do least without, is a phenomena deserving our attention and reflection. That's what we're endeavoring, yeah, to give it our attention.
Yeah.
Um, this is evidently the effect, not of the thoughtlessness of. Let's go down a little bit. The It's off my screen. The end of that sentence. Sorry, a bit up, a bit up. Not the thoughtlessness of not of the thoughtlessness of our age, but of its ripened power of judgment, which will no longer be put off with illusory knowledge, and which demands that reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, and to institute a court of justice, by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions. And this is not by mere decrees, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable laws. And this court is none other than the critique of pure reason itself.
Cool.
That's
You want
a
to read
mic
the
drop.
footnote? Yeah. You want to read that? I'll read the footnote as well to the power of judgment, because it'll become an
Ah,
important thing. Now and again, one hears complaints about the superficiality of our age's way of thinking, and about the decay of well-grounded science. Yet I do not see that those sciences whose grounds are well laid, such as mathematics, physics, etc., in the least deserve this charge. Rather, they maintain their old reputation for well-groundedness, and in the case of natural science, even surpass it. This same spirit would also prove itself effective in other species of cognition if only care had first been taken to correct their principles. In the absence of this indifference, doubt, and finally strict criticism are other proofs of a well-grounded way of thinking. Our age is the genuine age of criticism, to which everything must submit. Religion, through its holiness, and legislation, through its majesty, commonly seek to exempt themselves from it. But in this way, they excite a just suspicion against themselves and cannot lay claim to that unfeigned respect that reason grants only to that which has been able to withstand its free and public examination. So, a couple things. I mean, it's definitely a mic drop moment, that previous sentence that you read.
Mm.
But I think maybe before we get to that mic drop moment, just reflect about the age that he's finding himself in, right? Like, where in the world is he finding himself in at this moment?
Yeah, that's this part about the ripening power of judgment I found really interesting, and that's a kind of a vision of the way that he's seeing the age that he's writing in and to and from.
Mhm.
But if you just scroll a little bit up, if you wouldn't mind. Sorry, the other way. The um because I want to press in there. I think it's the right question. I'm only going here because I'm wondering if it has relevance, and it's just because it struck as odd. Occurring amid the flourishing of all sciences and directly precisely at those sciences whose results. So the yes, that was the wondering, like this indifference that marks his age, that is also this time of the ripening of the power of judgment, occurring amid the flourishing of all sciences and directed precisely at those sciences whose results we could do least without. That's that's a strange. It's a
Yeah,
like the opposite. It's like the opposite of the what's being achieved in science or in the sciences and the flourishing of sciences. It's like goes along with it, or um, and it's toward, or it's directed precisely at those. It's directed at the sciences whose results we do. So indifferentism is sounding less and less indifferent. Yes, is the sense, is it?
yeah. Uh, what sciences are they indifferent towards is the question, right? And you might want to think about how indifferentism plays out today, right? If it does at all, is a question to be raised. But if it would, what sciences do you think are at issue here?
For Kant, when was he? Yeah, I would just guess like natural sciences occurring with the flourish. I would he be including metaphysics there? I mean, I guess natural sciences.
So there's two kinds of sciences, right? And he might be using the word in two different senses. So all sciences and directly at precisely those sciences whose results we could do least without, right? So there's all the sciences are flourishing, but the indifference is pointed towards those sciences whose results we could do least without.
Ah,
And we should pay attention to that. So like he's writing at a time, I mean, we'll see this in the B preface, where science is really moving along. I guess like Newton had come on the scene. And again, we talked about the Copernican revolution recently. And so there seems to be all this development, right, in the sciences that's happening. And somehow, amidst all this development, there's also this indifferentism towards sciences whose results, if they have results at all, we could least do without. So there might be these sciences that we're not sure could actually be achieved. Metaphysics might be one of those sciences, right? If metaphysics is a science, whether metaphysics can be a science is a question. It's on the table. And what a science is also a question that's on the table. What kind of things are sources of knowledge? But you might want to think about the ripened power of judgment, right? In the case of natural science, physics and maths surpass their old reputation. They become even better grounded, I think is what he says in this line here. And he says the same spirit would also prove itself effective in other species of knowledge if only care had been first been taken to correct their principles. In the absence of this, indifference, doubt, and finally strict criticisms are rather proof of a well-grounded way of thinking. And then he says that his age is the genuine age of criticism. So indifferentism and doubt seem to be moments towards strict criticism. It's like you can doubt the sciences and then they just show you that you can't actually doubt them. Like you can attempt to doubt them, but that attempt always ends in failure because they're well-grounded. And so there might be another science other than metaphysics that he has in mind. We might want to keep that on the table. He does talk about religion and religion through its holiness and its majesty commonly seek to exempt themselves from it, but in this way they excited just suspicion against themselves and cannot lay claim to that unrefrained respect that reason grants only to that which has been able to withstand its free and public examination. So we want to maybe think, is religion science? And if it is, what would it deal with? I would imagine that its object would be God and things related to God. That might have also formed a part of metaphysics in the past, and it might still form a part of metaphysics. If God is a being and metaphysics studies being, is metaphysics not a study of God in some way? One of the debates about Aristotle's metaphysics is whether it's an ontology or a theology, whether the being that it studies is reality or God. I can't remember which way that gets like decided, but it's a question of debate. Another question might be if there's other sciences that have relevance. There might be a question of whether ethics could be a science, right? That could be something that we could least do without. It's weird that he says at those sciences whose results, if such are to be had at all, we could least do without, right? It's not as if the sciences couldn't exist without us. It's almost as if though we couldn't exist without them, which is very bizarre. Like we have this need for certain sciences, and this is something that will come up over and over again. The nature of reason is such that it has these characteristics, and it seems like one of the features of metaphysics is that, and one of the features of reason is that it needs certain sciences. In the same way that maybe like an animal needs food to live, reason might need certain material to sort of express itself, come to full fruition. So those are interesting questions and really worth thinking about. But this passage about the illusory knowledge, like shedding illusory knowledge and demanding that reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, and to institute a course of justice by which reason may secure its rightful claims, while dismissing all ground and thus own eternal and unchangeable laws. And this is none other than the critique of pure reason itself. That's really a difficult. What do you think about that?
It jumped out a few times, but I mean the text is out here in front of me. I have the compulsion to try and draw out the indifferent position a bit more before the mic drop, like because there seems to be, you're frozen on my side. Yeah. This, because there seems to be an analog, like with the sciences today and that are flourishing, people that are in the sciences. It's the froze again. Are you there?
Yeah, it's frozen.
Frozen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we're having jumps in the network connectivity. It looks like Hadley's still frozen. In and out. We appreciate your patience if you're following along with us. Maybe it's this mic drop moment. I'm going to pause again. Okay, we're back on. We appreciate your patience with us if you're following along. We're sorry for the disruptions. It's the indifferentists in the Zoom head office that are out for us, trying to do metaphysics. So I Hadley got to the mic drop moment of where Kant, well, he prefaces his critique, what he's up to, and what you'd be up to if you join him. I wanted there's something there's something that I'm trying to metabolize here around the indifference, and there was a sense of there being something um, of an analog to our own moment, our own how science is operates, or the people that do science. There's this oddity of there's a flourishing of science, and amidst that, or maybe even amidst the people who are enjoying that flourishing, there's an indifference that is directed precisely at those sciences whose results we could least do without. Now, I'm making the assumption you're speaking of metaphysics or, say, philosophy, um, and that this question of what, or the space in which the questioners are, like what grounds this method, what grounds this process, and I think also who are you in the process of doing the science,
Mm-hmm.
is precisely what the science is going to have an indifferent, the scientist is going to have an indifferent attitude about, and that's the that's the kind of context from which I was using the word castration, which I really enjoyed your suggesting the difference of self-difference, saying it's self-difference, because that is itself a really self-discipline,
Mm-hmm.
because that is itself a really interesting reflection on reason's relationship to itself and how it might need to, or by its critique, impose on itself limits for its appropriate functioning. That might be the a framing of the project. So the sense then is that this this indifference that seems to be sourced or part and parcel of the flourishing of all sciences,
Mm-hmm.
other sciences, might be, well, as I said, part and parcel of the dismissal of an important science.
Mm-hmm.
And it has something to do with like its grounding, it's and being able to ask or question that, and like if you question that, you kind of like you like fuddle the fun, you fuddle what's happening by
Mm-hmm.
asking towards the ground, and so that there's resistance to it, or indifference. There's dismissal of it through indifference, or um, sometimes,
Yeah, who cares? We're getting the results. Why should we worry about the grounds, right?
yeah,
Like,
yes,
we should
yeah.
keep being productive. It's
So
not
please,
productive to worry about the the grounding for the
Yeah.
findings. We've got science and we're doing science right now, and the results we're getting are right. So we shouldn't investigate the grounds. We should just keep deriving results, right? Isn't that how that works?
Yes. So this is I need you to help me here to draw out this indifference, because I think it applies more generally
Mm-hmm.
to thinking beings,
Mm-hmm.
to someone who exists in a socio-historical moment, who's thinking about who is living, their life, is
Mm-hmm.
applying a certain thought
Mm-hmm.
to that life that makes it seem obvious that certain things should be done and certain things not be done.
Mm-hmm.
There's the attitude of indifference is precisely that attitude that is against the question of the question that kind of brings that context into relief.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the running of things as they are,
Mm-hmm.
there's a resistance to coming into contact with that sequestering, or that self-discipline, or but there's something there that I want to,
Well,
I don't know.
that's the issue, right? That's his complaint about religion in the bottom paragraph, that like if these sciences were really on secure footing, they wouldn't be scared of the criticism because, well, they wouldn't mind the criticism because it wouldn't just be a waste of time or something. It would just make them more well grounded. But maybe part of the issue is that like these sciences that are flourishing. And if you take a moment to go, well, what's going on? Like, how do we explain the flourishing, or how do we explain the results that are going on? And what's the methodology that you're using to come to these conclusions? There's the risk that you might have to scrap it, right? There's the risk that the foundation will turn out to be unsecure, and we could just be drawing haphazard conclusions that just sound right, and we might just like the sound of them for a long time until we realize, wow, that was a bad assumption to be proceeding along. And we can, I mean, it's easy to get comfortable in thinking, and it's like, it's normal to get comfortable in thinking because one wants results, one wants products. We need to eat, and we need to get the job done, and we need to live our day-to-day lives. And it seems like when we turn back and ask the question, what are we doing? We are bringing this really big interruption into our day-to-day being. We are pausing to reflect on it. And if we reflect, there's the danger that what we've been doing all along might not be what we should be doing. Maybe we should be doing something else. Maybe we should be reformulating mathematics or physics so that they can match the reality that they're supposed to match. Or maybe we should be thinking about ethics and how we should behave in them and what the principles of our behavior should be. How do we come to a decision about what we ought to be thinking about? And not only that, the indifference seems to be like an inbuilt moment in theorizing, right? The theorizer is coming up with these theories and like putting them onto the world and seeing that the world works with them. And they come to see that it works even if we don't think about the problems involved in metaphysics that popped up in dogmatism. And it works even if we don't like let ourselves be like prey to skepticism. We just keep getting results and the results work, but we don't know why and we can't say why. And anybody that asks us to say why is crazy because they're asking for something that shouldn't be or can't even be done, right? Like all of these other moments in the history of reason show us that it's been attempted. We don't know how we get to the answers we get, or we don't know why we must be getting things right all the time. But we get along fine without it. We don't have to. Don't don't interrupt the machine working of like ordinary life, dude. It works fine, right? Like, but then you brought out this like wanting to privilege one science over another science, and you might want to think about amidst the flourishing of all sciences and directed towards those sciences whose results, if such are to be had at all, we could do least without. You might want to think about how the flourishing of mathematics and even physics in contemporary times even has directed itself towards or against certain sciences that have import for our human being nature. Right? We so often get carried away with the objective facts about the way things are that we forget that we're the ones theorizing, and that like the theorizer has certain needs, right? They are a certain kind of being. That's a metaphysical assertion in and of itself. They are a being and they have a certain kind of nature, maybe. And that nature requires maybe more than mathematics and physics. Not to say that those aren't important, and not to say that those aren't worthwhile sciences that people should go along their day to day and do. But maybe there are maybe a life is complex and there are many parts of life and there are many parts of fundamentally human or theorizing, uh, each of which should have their proper proportion. Maybe we shouldn't privilege one science over the other, or maybe we should give each of them their due respect and engage with them all adequately. We shouldn't privilege the fact that we're getting results just to like undermine the attempt to see what those results are based on, because that's weird, right? It's suspicious. Like it shows that we're unconfident in the very thing that we're going through. But if we were really confident, if we like really knew that our sciences were strong, and I think that certain sciences should have the right to feel that way, mathematics, physics, biology, maybe, all have like a grounded claim to theorize. So why avoid the self-examination? All you could find out is that, you know, either you're doing something right or you're doing something wrong. And the only thing that could come about is that you do something better. But it's scary to do something better because it means leaving behind what we're used to, pausing for a moment and interrupting our day-to-day flow of thinking, right? To self-examine is difficult. You can go through life living like a very like NPC sort of lifestyle, and you can probably get along very fine. Like, but it's difficult to look in the mirror and go, should I be doing this? Right? Is this the proper way to exist? And is the way that I exist in line with the rest of reality? Or is it just some mistaken path that I've trodden down for too
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a there's something interesting there in terms of what that there both seems to be in the context of your question, how is it possible to change the world?
long?
There both seems to be a power in the reflection, in reflecting on the my terms of engagement,
Yeah,
what I take to be as obvious or useful.
yeah. I
There's
mean,
like a
you can concretize that even more when you focus on the sciences, right? Or when you focus on your knowledge, right? What we take to be true does fundamentally shape our world. Like our ideas give edge and uh, distinctiveness to our world. So imagine again the shift from the Ptolemaic system to the Copernican system, right? Like this is a shift of you seeing the sun as rotating around you and feeling as if you're the center of the universe to going, oh wow, actually we're the ones rotating, we're not the center of the universe. Or to give another example, shifting from like Newton and gravity to understanding that like this force pulls things down at a certain rate that's sort of proportional to the radius of the Earth and has this effect. Like gravity is such a powerful concept. And when you think about it, like it really does weigh us down in many ways. Like we feel firmly planted on the ground because of gravity. And that means
yeah
that like, we orient ourselves and think about things in terms of gravity. Like kids always like when I was younger, like if you like try to like jump up and fly, they'd be like, "Don't be ridiculous." Like, like we can't. And there are many ways that we can fly. Just it happens to have to be in line with gravity. Planes, etc., are ways that humans have found to maybe defy gravity at least momentarily. Um, and we can only see those things through having these concepts, and watching them change is really important, right? Like we live in fundamentally different times because of the concepts that are active and at play in the world that we come into being.
There's a I'm just going to turn on the light quick. I couldn't get it. There's a contradiction. There's a in the sense of that power to determine that you're just speaking of, that exhibits itself in the sciences that give us real world, well, that shape our world. It's that reflection of like how much in the room around me right now is the materialization of someone's idea at some stage.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's immense that.
Yeah.
But there's this into this the indifference around uh, say the nature of reason, or metaphysics, being, the
Mm-hmm.
nature of being, the nature of my being, your being. There seems to be, on the one hand, there's the there's the power that is afforded by the reflection. There's a power, but then there seems to be um, like a limitation, or that seems that I mean that seems to be a thrust in the project, in the critique, that something might be lost, or that something of what I'm enjoying in the flourishing my of the sciences might
Mm-hmm.
be uh, castrated, to use the word that I used, the like, or limited, that
Mm-hmm.
I'm no longer going to be able to enjoy my claim for or over something if I come to examine, or this might be the judgment, or the court or critique, or if I come to examine that, there there's a limiting, I guess, is what I was getting at. But then, and then now this is like, so the initial contradiction, and then it now seems to come back to the power side, which is that there seems to be an affordance in the very limitation, that reason given to its proper uh, material can act more appropriately to that material, so it is more effective, it's more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's a liberating of to, the energy of reason, the resource of reason, so that it is taken away from this that maybe I should try and flesh it out a bit more in my own mind, but that like sequestered place in which it's just the dogmatic assertion of this idea, and then the skeptical denial that that idea is not possible, that back and forth, and these endless controversies about causation and necessity. If I see something caused in the world, then I kind of infer there must be an original cause, or the like first cause. So then I'm postulating the great causer of all things. um, if it can't be that everything is contingent, there has to be something necessary. Okay, the necessary thing must be being, and then etc. The reason, what what I'm at least thinking at this stage of Kant is that he's introducing the project that the castration is removing reason from uh, inappropriate domain and putting it onto what it's uh, applicable to. So limiting it. That's a limitation. But there seems to be a power in that. Right? I'm fuddling around this sense of a contradiction. There seems to be like three movements. It's a
Yeah. One of the things that I think we should maybe say as well is that as someone who reads Kant, Kant is very difficult because of this apparent contradiction that might be coming into play. But as you can see, we're like a page or two into the preface, and it's just been problem upon problem upon problem. And it seems like there's almost no relief. But like, this is the way that this sort of a text works. Like the preface and the introduction, all of this stuff is like setting the stage for these problems, and then Kant is going to maybe give us some sort of alternative, like to avoid, to escape the cycle of contradiction. Because if you really think about it, the dogmatists who claim to read off the character of being straight away are doing something interesting. But the skeptic is just as dogmatic as the dogmatist in denying that we can't know the nature of being. And the indifferentist is doubly dogmatic in saying that we can't know anything. So there seems to be a kind of dogmatism operative in all three of these stages. And maybe there's some sort of like dogmatic nature to reason in general. Maybe there's like something that reason wants to do that is dogmatic. But if it does it in a specific sense or way, it's going to abuse its own power, so to speak, and think that it's doing something that it actually isn't doing. Um, so there's this really like difficult concept of, and it'll come up in this section on the court that we just read, of self-examination. Like, so we brought up the concept of self-discipline, but I want to talk about self-examination since we've been talking about the sciences, and we said that like what I said was like there's this contradiction in what I was saying about like the theorizer and theorizing shapes the world. But in science, the world is supposed to shape the theorizing, right? Like we're not supposed to like make up theories. We're supposed to describe the way the world works. Like if F equals ma wasn't actually how we figured out force, then we shouldn't use mass and acceleration to figure out the rate of force or something like that. Or if like things didn't fall at 9.11 meters per second, I don't remember the figure, then we just say that that's wrong, right? Because the world doesn't correspond to our ideas. But even to say that the world corresponds to our ideas is to say that there's a match or a fit, and the fit is with the world and with us. And so we want to ask the question whether, like, when you look in the mirror, it's very fun because you can ask the question, like, is the me that's looking in the mirror me, or is the reflection of me the me looking at me in the mirror, right? Like, which me is me? And somehow both are the same and yet also different. And so when science's ideas are reflected into the world, we might ask the question, is the idea reflected in the world, or is the world reflected in the idea? Nietzsche has this one line about, like, can't remember what Greek play it was. I think it's Oedipus. And he says, like, we arrive like Oedipus in front of the Sphinx, and we wonder whether we're looking at the Sphinx or whether the Sphinx is looking at us. Like, who's the questioner in this thing? Does the world question us, or do we question the world? And how do we figure out whether these like thoughts correspond, or like whether we can figure out the world, right? Like that's itself a question that's up on the table for debate, right? Like the dogmatists say, yeah, of course we know what the world is, and we can just read it off, right? Like we can just get the information from the world, and our ideas correspond to the world. The world shapes our thinking in this very meaningful way. Like But then the skeptics go, no, we don't have any access to this external reality. We never know whether our thoughts correspond to the world, right? That's the dreamer position. We can't tell whether the world is just a dream or not. And so it seems like we don't know whether any of our ideas actually apply to it. And then finally, the indifferentist is someone who goes, well, who cares if our ideas really apply? We seem to be getting on just fine. They so seem to apply. We can't figure it out, and we don't have the answers, but we can just do this work, and we can carry on as if though it works until like it breaks down, and then we'll have to do something different. And what else should we expect? After all, we're only human, right? And so these all seem like reasonable positions, and they all have some sort of claim to being correct, but they all emphasize completely different positions. And you might want to think as well, not only are these positions or ways of being, they also things articulated by people, right? Or thinkers, rational agents or whatever. And whether those, I don't know, I don't mind whether there are other rational agents other than human beings, but for the time being, let's stick with the sort of intellectual history that we've come onto the scene with. They're all the same, they all have the same type of nature. They all partake in reason, and reason is making these claims about itself, but viewing and coming to very completely different conclusions about itself. It's like reason has moods or something. And like when reason is like feeling excited, it's like, yeah, of course I can know about the world, man. Like that's just my nature. And when it's feeling a bit blue, it's like, no, I don't know. I have no idea whether my ideas apply. And then when reason's a bit grumpy, it's like, it doesn't matter whether my ideas apply. We can just get on with it. Like, just go through the day to day. We have no clue. But maybe there's a reason that could be confident, right? Like a quiet confidence, one that's not like overexcited, one that doesn't overstate its claims to the reality that it can determine or know about, one that is just calm in its abilities and knows its place in the world and in relation to the world. And I think maybe that's what we're working towards in a sense through the critique of theorism is like in a very meaningful way, figuring out our place in it, or figuring out reason's place in the world. And we can only do that by figuring out the relationship between reason and reality, or reason and the world. And we can only do that, we can only figure out the relationship if we know what reason is and if we know what the world is, right? Because the relationship is a relationship between two things. So it seems like there's these three that are always like dancing around one another, and we're trying to figure out how they are properly connected. Uh, because they can be, it seems like they can appear to be connected in these multiplicities of matters.
Shall we go to that paragraph there that you interrupted the flow there?
I think the interruption was very worthwhile because we're going to continue to problematize and continue to see issues come up. I think this is and actually like the mirror example is this example. So let's just read it again. I'll just go from the top of that passage and then we can talk about it. This
It
is
just
evident. Yeah.
from where you want to go?
This is evidently.
Yeah. So this is evidently not the effect. This is evidently the effect, not of the thoughtlessness of our age, but of its ripened power of judgment, which will no longer be put off with illusory knowledge, and which demands that reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, and to institute a court of justice, by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions. And this not by mere decrees, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable laws. And this court is none other than the critique of pure reason itself. So the critique of pure reason is reason taking itself to court. It's reason seeking knowledge of itself. It's reason wanting to know.
Well,
It's self knowledge.
mhm. But notice what he says about self-knowledge, hey? He's not like he doesn't say that it's going to be easy. He says that it's the most difficult of all its tasks, right?
Yeah. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, think about it. Reason has to take itself to court, and in a court, I think the courtroom metaphor is great. What do you have in a court? A judge, a
Judge.
jury, and a defendant, or something like that. And
Yeah.
what role are each of them playing? The defendant is on the bench being charged for something, and they have to state their claim and say, "No, man, I'm not really guilty about this, right? I didn't actually commit these crimes, and I didn't do this, so I shouldn't be sentenced for this. Like, I shouldn't be censured, and I shouldn't be put away because of this." And the judge is supposed to be impartial, right? The judge is supposed to be this like figure that
Yeah.
can listen and hear out the defendant, properly provide like a criterion to judge their guilt, to make sure that they're not being wrongfully imprisoned or something like that. And the jury is supposed to be a room full of people that have like different opinions and can come together and like form a consensus that is correct about what should happen to the criminal. I'm not super sure about this, like this explanation, but that seems to kind of be the idea of what the law court is doing. But think about the weird case in the case of the critique of pure reason. Who's on trial? Who's judging? And who's the jury?
Yeah.
Reason is the defendant. It's on trial. Reason is the judge, because how else could one judge if not rationally? And reason is the jury, because who else could think about and deliberate the case that it's making? Reason has to be all three and yet fail to be impartial to itself in any one respect or as reason. Reason can't like overstate its own claims or like misjudge itself or be like a suspect jury. It has to somehow play all these roles and go back and forth with itself. I imagine it like running from the defendant's like desk to like the judge's desk and like putting on this white wig and then like moving down to like the courtroom floor. And like how difficult is that process of coming to self-knowledge, right? Like can you ever know yourself? Like is that is that possible? And like how do we ever do it? How do we find the sort of criterion that's unbiased when only reason is around to give us the criterion? Reason is the only thing that can rationally deliberate about the outcome of things. And yet it always seems like it has some sort of bias, possibly, this inescapable bias towards itself. Of course, reason wants to affirm itself, right? It couldn't help but, because any deliberation would itself be a reason. And so reason
Yeah.
has to reason about reasoning in this case and figure out what on earth it is and what on earth it's doing. And as reasoners who are now in the critique of pure reason, the court of reason, we find ourselves on the bench, right? And also playing judge and also jury, because not only do we have to reason about the nature of reason, right? Not only do we have to figure out what reason is capable of, what knowledge can know, whether metaphysics can be done, but we also have to decide whether Kant's critique is correct, whether it's been correctly implemented, and to argue against the critique is itself to reason, right? the only way that we could show that it was wrong was by reasoning against it. But if we reason against it, we're using reason. And so reason has this weird like bootstrapping effect where it just like turns on its own wheels. It wants to like be engaged with. And probably the best thing that you could do for a text like this is try and argue against it. Because what else could reason do other than continuously assert itself? Right?
Hmm. There's this element here in the court image of, because it's the critique of pure reason. So it's the sense of some space has been opened up in which um, a dimension of reason, or the pure dimension of reason, is being brought into that, being brought into that court to be judged by that court. So there's a, that's your language of self-discipline is probably more appropriate in this instance. You know, it's like prior to that, reason, pure reason, was aristocratic. It could it could break the law, or it made the laws. It made the laws. It could just posit the law. It could do what it wanted, or it could just live under the law, and the I don't have to. It could deny the law.
Yeah.
But something's happening spatially, where, and the image of the court comes in, where it's and this is the how I'm now reading the ripened power of judgment. It's like this something is burgeoning, or reason, a space is opening up in which reason is being, what does he say, uh, secure. Reason is being judged, dismissing. Yeah, so it's asking to be secure. It's asking for it to secure itself. it's it's so funny. It's so hard to say because of the situation that you just elaborated. Because like reasons playing every role in the game. It's reason is reason the one asking, uh, or like laying down the accusation, or the um, I'm hoping you're not spending too much time in other courts otherwise, but we won't we won't get into any of that. Um, I'm seeing there, he, in the next paragraph, he kind of um, elaborates a bit there.
I wanna stop you from rushing ahead. Like, I want you to
Yeah,
stick with the problem. So I think maybe we should end on the next paragraph. But I want you to just think about that image that I've given. Again, like this like circular, we are working against ourselves and thinking about ourselves. And maybe think about one of the ways in which that might have been co-opted, right? Like reason is inescapable in this very like serious way. And so it does seem like it could be despotic, is like the aristocratic that you were describing, that it could just deny or obey its rules whenever it chose to. Like it could like break the law and then like come back into possession because it's only got itself to judge and it would be biased about it. Um, I think we're treading on dangerous territory in many ways section of the text. Like not only does indifferentism come up, you might want to think about like maybe some strains of postmodernism in which like we can't escape reason. And so like the only thing that we should do is like try to get like away from it. Um, because it's inescapable. Like there's like a bad inescapability maybe, and like a good inescapability. And we don't know as yet like which side to be on. Like there is the self-reflexive like nature of reason, but whether it's something that we should be like following or not following is itself up for debate, it appears. But if it even is up for debate, we must be following it because in order to debate it, we must be using reason. So even something like a postmodernism that challenges like this rationalist metaphysic or something like that, is itself engaged in a process of reason. So, like before we like rush off, it's important to like
Yeah.
sit with this. And
Yeah, yeah.
this
In
language is
in
so bizarre, right? He's like, institute a court of justice. Like, what role is justice playing here? Like, there seems to be this normative or like this ethical dimension to reason that must justly come to determine itself. And it says, while dismissing all its groundless pretensions, and this not by mere decrees, not by like things that it has put forward of its own as like assertions, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable laws. Like, where did that come from? And what reason are we talking about again? Like, we're all reasoners. Are we talking about a pure reason that is pure in the sense of like divine or unfettered by like bodily life? Or are we talking about human reason and like what's doing the judging and who is doing the judging? There's all these like really bizarre issues around this. And I think getting caught up in the intensity of the problematic is
yeah.
useful because it sets up the right amount of tension for Kant to like release in an important way.
Yes, yes.
You want to move on
I
to the next
mean,
one? We'll talk about this more.
no, no, no. Um, the I'll try to remain here, but like so reason's self knowledge of itself should take demands that reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self knowledge. So reason to come to knowledge of itself. The frame that I almost can't help but have, and that I kind of intimated with this language of like castration, and with the effect that I know shorthanded that Kant has had in terms of, um, or like this turning image, of bringing us back into the subject in terms of knowledge of what we can know. The the he it's a I don't mean to go ahead, the sense that what reason comes to reason about is what it can reason about it, experience. So there's something there's something about it being its relation to objects of knowledge that it takes itself to has taken itself to be able to possess, that comes into question, that has to do with this self-knowledge. So like reason functioning unaware of itself is in this play with the objects of its knowledge, the things that it knows. And that goes from the uh, sun rising and the match lighting and the fire, to the mathematical units and how they relate to each other, different logical procedures, or these different objects, or maybe like my mapping of uh, an ecology of some kind, or maybe one species, like I develop uh, sense of what that type is, and then what its wider family is. And I'm like mapping life forms, and maybe then I even something more general, like systematic, about the physical nature of the universe. And I have this knowledge. Reason attains to this knowledge of that material, how it works. There's something for what it means for that reason then to come to to itself knowledge. So in the court of justice, we're talking about something that happened, like some event or some series of event. Like, did you say that or did you not say that? Did you kill that person? Did you not kill that person? And then it's back and forth, and then we assess on the merits of evidence, and we say, okay, it's probable that you did do this. But now what you brought out, like, it's reasons in every position in that courtroom. It's products from the past, so it's like historicity is there in the courtroom. It's standing here in the judge attempting an impartial assessment. So it's to do with illusory knowledge. It's prohibiting itself from um, it wants to dismiss its groundless pretensions, but it's prohibiting itself by doing that by the use of mere decrees. So it can't re-establish this tone of the despotic, dogmatic dismissal of those groundless pretensions, because uh, it's realizing that about itself, reason that it's functioned in this way, and it's bringing that to a court of justice, and justice is then assuming to be something other than that manner of engagement with its material, with what it brings forth. So then it seems like the something there, like even rules of engagements, is going to be part of the reason's critique
Yeah, I mean,
of itself.
I I think that's really nice, and I think you brought out something very interesting that I want to talk about a little bit more. I want to hold off on the limiting of reason to experience. I'm not sure that we should like preempt that much, and
Yes.
I'm not sure that like it's even clear what that means at this
Yeah.
stage in the text, what experience is. If limiting it to experience means that we can only do empirical science, or if there's some kind of higher order metaphysics that's related to empirical science. These are all, I think, questions that might come to be answered in the text. And when we just say that, like, this history of Kant that's passed down in the whispers in the hallway, so to speak, like, he comes off as like an empiricist at times. He comes off as like this idealist at times. And it's like, you don't really know Kant at all until you get into the text and like see what his
Yeah.
experiences. Because like
Yeah.
it's at the outset at least, if you like heard these rumors, you might read the text in a specific way, and then you might believe something that you heard in like the hallway space. But his position, just as reason can overemphasize different aspects of itself, like his position seems like it can like be like toggled with in this way, and like a good reading ought to like do justice to all these aspects. But
Yeah.
the topic that you brought up in your conversation now about like is what I want to just return to. You brought up this topic of in a law court, we have the testimony of people, right? And we judge that testimony according to some sort of ideas. This evidence is usually like corrigible to some extent, right? Like it can be correct or it can be incorrect, and the judge has to decide what to take into account, what not to take into account. But Kant is doing something very weird here. The analogy is sort of breaking at the end and also holding itself together because in courts we do use laws, right? And laws are sort of like these normative constraints that the government has set up to decree and to sentence people. I don't know enough about laws to talk about this with the complexity that it can probably have. But laws seem to be dependent on the contingent constitution of the government, right? Like depending on which state we find ourselves in, Athens had different laws than probably Rome or something like that. And so like the laws seem like they could change depending on place and time. But he says not according to mere decrees, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable. And Kant is like a master of equivocation, I think. Um, Somehow we're in this courtroom and there's these laws and they're unchangeable and eternal. And they're not just contingent laws laid down by like government, but they're nature's own laws. And I think there's like so there's reason involved in creating the constitutions or laws. Like we have to like discuss them amongst the like the political body and like write them out, put them up. And then there's reason in entertaining the laws and stuff like that. But these are laws written to reason's own nature, right? Its own eternal and unchangeable laws. Somehow, what it is to be reason is to have laws, and
Yeah.
those laws are unchangeable and eternal. But also, the law analogy in the court of law seems to break down, because when you think about eternal and unchangeable laws, we're not thinking about judgments. We're not thinking about what a judge does in the court. We're thinking about nature. We're thinking about the law of gravity that is eternal and unchangeable. Or like the law that says that matter never changes in quantity, it only like shifts, like the principle of conservation of nature. Like we're thinking about eternal and unchangeable laws seem like universal laws, the laws of being. And so the analogy seems to be breaking down at the same time that it like builds itself back up again. Like reason is somehow like a judge, and also like the divine ordering of the cosmos, and also like an animal that has its own nature. It has like all of it's like a very pregnant analogy, and it like shoots off in all these directions. It's very interesting to think about. Like it's curious to try and figure out what a law is, and maybe Kant will have more to say about it during the course of the text, and what the power of judgment is, how we use the power of judgment. Um, but yeah, so I want to come to a close on this next paragraph. So I think we should read it, and it'll tell us more about the nature of reason, um, like how it's going to institute this court.
Right. Let me go. Yet, yet by this I do not understand a critique of books and systems, but a critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all the cognitions after which reason might strive independently of all experience, and hence the decision about the possibility or impossibility of a metaphysics in general, and the determination of its sources, as well as its extent and boundaries, all, however, from principles. I can definitely read that again.
You can if you want to.
Yeah. Yet by this I do not understand a critique of books and systems, but a critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all the cognitions after which reason might strive, independently of all experience. That's the pure reason. Pure reason is independent, is the cognitions after which reason strives independent of all experience. It's
Again,
pure
yeah,
reason.
it is, and there's still that ambiguity, right? Independent of all experience might mean not depending on experience, or it might mean apart from experience. So it's unclear how,
Yeah,
like, the word independent is being used in a strange and wonderful way, I think.
power. And hence the decision about the possibility or impossibility of a metaphysics in general. Yeah, because that's the it's an open question. I guess that's why there's the play there. Because the metaphysics prior would have assumed an independence of uh, cognitions free from experience,
Yeah,
and the determination of its sources, as well as its extent and boundaries, all, however, from principles. So, from those eternal and unchangeable laws.
yeah. So it's an open question about what the reason is, whether metaphysics is possible or not. Metaphysics seems to be one of those weird subjects that is the only subject that has to establish its own possibility.
Endlessly.
Yeah, he says anew, right, in that paragraph above, that
Ah,
anew is taken the most difficult of all its tasks. And so metaphysics has to like continuously engage in this self-justifying endeavor
Wow.
because it can't take anything for granted. It can't even take
Yeah.
itself for granted, right? It has to establish itself. Otherwise, it would depend on something prior to it, and then we'd have to establish the validity or the certainty of that thing that it depended
Yeah.
on. And this is a strange. I mean, there's so many strange lines in this. Reason might strive is an odd one. The word strive seems to be very odd.
Yeah.
Striving is like an effortuous process. Like it takes place over a period of time or something. And so the striving seems to be like antithetical to the very being that it's supposed to be getting at. Because if being is the object of metaphysics, and it just is, what on
Yeah.
earth is the notion that's happening? Right? Like if being is sort of like the harmony of being that always is the same and nothing is not, then you get all these like Zeno's paradoxes of motion involved. So what's the motion between reason and the striving? What is the role that that's playing? And then I wanted to point out one last thing, and this is on the conversation of like how to change the world. This opening line, yet by this I do not understand a critique of books and systems. It's an odd line, and it's odd
Yeah. I
because
know. Yeah.
he's, he starts off with the history of philosophy, this intellectual history. And then the intellectual history, you might want to say, is a physical or empirical history. There's Aristotle's books, and there's Descartes' books, and there's the system of Spinoza, and the system of like Leibniz or whoever he's coming in after. And the word intellectual history has this wonderful ambiguity built into it. Like, is the intellectual history the stuff that we get from the world that influences us? Or is it the history of the intellect itself? Is it the story of reason's self development? What kind of intellectual history do we have? And are these moments in the intellectual history not just books and systems, but part of the nature of reason's self development, part of the story of reasoning in general? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are they just stages of reason, like childhood and teenagehood, adulthood are stages of life?
Yeah. It's the ripening. There's a ripening that's happening now, or in the context of how he's writing, the ripening of something, of the power of judgment.
That's really like interesting for how we engage with others. Like, do we take their positions as just stuff that comes up in our day-to-day life? Or is the stuff that comes up in our day-to-day life like an expression of some higher manifestation of reasoning or being or whatever? Like, what are we even in conversation with when we're in conversation with another?
Boy. Shall we leave it there?
And so I think it's a good place to call it.
Right. I zoomed out. Okay, power. From principles.